or like on a weekend.
Yeah. The time.
You get to take the girls on. Somebody's and they're gonna hang out. My sister's gonna be out there. They can hear you there.
Hi, everybody. We're about to get started. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. My name is Zachary. I'm a librarian here at Northeast Harbor. And before we get started, I would like to share that the library is able to offer free programs like this year-round, thanks to the generosity of our donors and our collaborators like the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. Where are we? This is the second of 4 summer lectures with the MDI Historical Society, featuring contributors from the 2024 Chebacco Journal. If you'd like to see more about the library's upcoming programs, please subscribe to our weekly email newsletter. There is a sign-up sheet to the left of the door there, and to the right of the door, there's a lovely display set up by the Historical Society, as well as a sign-up for their newsletter. You're going to want to know what's going on there. So now for a few announcements, and to introduce tonight's speaker, I'll pass things over to the Assistant Director of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, Lisa Taplin-Murray.
Tonight, I'm really pleased to welcome Ella Kotsen, speaking about her 2024 Chebacco article, Ruth Moore's Microcosm, Narratives That Deconstruct Notions of Inside and Outside. She will speak for approximately half an hour, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask afterward. I first met Ella about 3 summers ago when I was a director of the Bass Harbor Memorial Library in Bernard, and I was pulling together our annual Ruth Moore Days celebration. And one of the Tremont Historical Society's board members and one of our board members had been raving about this amazing intern that they had that summer, and that was Ella. She was from Bryn Mawr College, and she was hired to initially help them with office accessions work, but she became obsessed with Ruth Moore. As a Hannah Holborn Gray Fellow at Bryn Mawr, she was doing ethnographic research for her report, Ruth Moore's Quiet Side and the Power of Island Voices. And I invited her to be part of the Ruth Moore Days and present her report. Now, this was during the summer when Tremont had neighbor versus neighbor about 2 possible campgrounds. Airbnbs were starting to flare up, and it was a contentious summer over in Tremont. And if anybody who's ever read Ruth Moore knows, she crafted incredibly poignant yet entertaining stories about small town politics, family grudges, and the struggle for economic survival. And obviously these issues are still going on today. Ella's talk was incredibly insightful, inspiring, not just for the audience, but to the many relatives of Ruth's who also attended. When I moved to the MDI Historical Society 2 years ago, I was quick to invite Ella to contribute to our 2024 edition of Chebacco. And tonight, Ella will speak about how Ruth Moore herself and the characters in her novels so deftly challenged the notions of the insulated, isolated island culture, in that people from away and natives both had insight and perspective that was vital for the economic and cultural survival of Maine's island communities. In 2023, Ella graduated from Bryn Mawr with a degree in literatures and English and is currently a board member of the Tremont Historical Society. She received the Sheila Kilroy Memorial Scholarship in English and the Seymour Edelman Book Collector's First Prize for a collection that she dubbed Female Writers from Maine. Her senior thesis was entitled The Invisible Spinster in Region, peripheral space of social and geographical narratives in Sarah Orne Jewett's The Country of the Pointed Firs. I am very pleased to welcome Ella Kotsen.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a really great introduction. I feel like I just learned some more stuff about myself. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Ella. I'm a board member at the Tremont Historical Society. And as Lisa already kind of summed up my introduction, I graduated from Bryn Mawr in the spring of 2023 with a degree in English, and I'm going to be starting my PhD at Boston University in the fall in the American and New England Studies program, which I'm very excited about. Also because I'll be a lot closer to the island, which is awesome. So I've been coming to the island for about 4 summers now. And so I guess you could call me a summer person, but I hope after this talk, we can sort of deconstruct that label. So let's get into it. So I was introduced to Chebacco by Lisa when I gave the talk for Ruth Moore Day 2 years ago. And I want to start with some thank yous. So I want to thank everyone at the Tremont Historical Society, the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and the Northeast Harbor Library for hosting the lecture today, and for supporting my writing and research on these topics that have interested me. And they're also just some of the best people I've ever met. So I want to start with that. So I'm going to dive right into talking about my article by giving some context, which you probably already know about Ruth Moore's background. So next, I'll go into the specifics of why I chose some of the stories I wrote about and dig a little deeper into the themes. And towards the end, I'll talk about my own experience with the concept of being both an outsider and an insider, or perhaps existing as both and neither. My Chebacco article set out to deconstruct the strict binary of outsider versus insider, and I hope we can continue to explore that here in this talk today. So there are 3 themes I'm going to focus on: education, identity, and perspective. I hope as time goes on, it becomes clear why. All right, so to start, a lot of you guys already know this history, so I apologize if it's just your family history that I'm recounting right now. Ruth Moore was born in 1903 on Gott's Island, Maine, into a working family with island roots that spanned 5 generations. Moore's grandfather, Enoch Moore, was the first on the island to take in boarders. This outsider dynamic would not be lost on Ruth, writing of boarders and visitors in many of her novels. This dynamic and theme that Moore wrote about constantly was my initial inspiration for the article. Moore left the island in her teen years to attend Ellsworth High School, where she reportedly hated the school. And Sylvia McDonald Young, who was a classmate of Ruth's, remembers the snooty Ellsworth kids made fun of her because she was an island girl, because of the way she dressed, talked, her homemade and unfashionable bright-colored clothes, and also because she was very smart and outspoken. Ruth graduated college in 1925 as an English major, after which she worked as secretary to Mary White Ovington, one of the founders of the NAACP, and she continued working with the organization for many years. She would return to Maine from 1931 to 1932 in an attempt to receive a master's degree in English, only to drop out and continue to move around the country, later even working for Reader's Digest. It was not until 1947 that Moore permanently moved back to Bass Harbor with her lifelong partner, Eleanor Mayo. Together, and with the help of Mayo's father, they built a home located down the road from the Bass Harbor headlight that still stands to this day, and is home to her niece, who is here in the audience today. Just want to shout her out. While Moore's novels, poems, and ballads offer uniquely vivid depictions of timeless island stories, I have always been particularly interested in Moore's belief that Maine islands are a microcosm of anywhere else. As she wrote in a letter to Maine author Sanford Piffin in 1980 when referencing the reception her stories received. And this is a theme I talked about 2 years ago during Ruth Moore Day at the Bass Harbor Library. And what I was interested in diving deeper into with this article, it was not only the concept of a microcosm, but the constant labels of outsider and insider that are a fundamental element to Moore and other regionalist writers' writing. So in my Chebacco article, to explain how influences on the island break down notions of outsider and insider, I looked at 3 separate novels and their characters who embody this relationship with the outside. I started with The Where, Sale Comey and Harold Turner's experience going to school off island. Next, I examined Spoonhandle and Joe Sanger, a Portuguese immigrant who personified Moore's vision of an island and culture that included everyone. Lastly, I examined the role of Jewish teacher Alfred Berg and the role that he played in opening the local eyes to the broader world in The Walk Down Main Street. And let me finish by saying, yes, there are so many more characters and books I could have included, like Miss Peterson and Speak to the Winds, but I had to choose to cut myself off somewhere. So I apologize if your favorite character or novel didn't make the final cut. So to start, The Where takes place on a pre-World War II small fishing island called Comey Island, just like Gott Island where Moore grew up. In many ways, to me, there are autobiographical elements, or at least moments where her local characters express feelings and sentiments in the same way I'm sure Ruth felt when she was forced to go to school in Ellsworth. In my article, I focused on 2 characters, Sale Comey and Harold Turner. Both are island boys with families that are rooted in the island's fishing tradition. When they are forced to go to the harbor town to receive schooling, just like Ruth having to go to school in Ellsworth, they feel mixed feelings. Harold feels at least a little bit entranced by the opportunities off island, saying, quote, "The harbor wasn't much of a town as towns went, but compared to Comey Island in the wintertime, it was a lighted metropolis." Sale, on the other hand, says, "To hell with school," and is only attending because his family forces him. This debate, to stay or to leave, is a sort of constant defining factor of the boys' self-worth. Each is determined to make money and improve their material realities. Harold represents an understanding of what the outside can bring him, versus Sale, who represents the tradition of staying on the island to make it big there. This is our first really big introduction to the binaries that island people are forced to contend with: stay like Sale and be uneducated, or leave and lose touch like Harold. I want to quote a passage from my article where I talk about this decision. On the one hand, if an islander ventures off to try to break generational struggles of dangerous labor, they are deemed as rednecked, ignorant, or ill-bred. If they do not leave and continue to fish, they face those dangerous realities that ultimately led to the death of both Sale's mother and brother. Sorry for the spoiler. It's also really important to understand that the first reason many island kids are forced to leave is because of education. To stay or to leave is bigger than just staying or leaving. Because of the stigmas that other Harold and Sale from receiving an education, they are essentially discouraged from adapting any sort of social mobility or educational mobility. The irony of the harbor kids calling them ignorant and ill-bred in school is that they are in school trying to become the opposite. So no wonder Sale stays on the island. I believe one of Moore's biggest lessons she is trying to teach her readers is when we deem others as outsiders, we not only undercut their innate human value, but we immobilize their potential for growth. The decision to leave the island is not only about making the huge step to actually leave, but to build courage to deal with those who other you for being from the outside. And then the exact same thing happens if you decide to return to the island from the outside. Those insiders who you were once a part of might judge you for your education, way of talking, and new position. Or as Sven Davison describes in When Fully Craddock Tore Off My Grandfather's Thumb, the collected stories of Ruth Moore and Eleanor Mayo, when Moore and Mayo came back after receiving an education, they, by local standards, were considered to be putting on airs. Moore saw and experienced both sides when she went to school in Ellsworth and came back to settle in Bass Harbor decades later. Let's move on to the next novel to keep looking at this idea. So Joe Sanger, a Portuguese immigrant to the Spoon Handle and Little Spoon Island community, is one of Moore's most obvious outsider characters. Joe, who has a thick accent and is unable to, as Ruth says, master hearing in English. I just love the way she develops that concept, not speaking, but hearing English. He also has a distaste for cold weather that, as you all know, plagues the New England seasons. These qualities are the surface level features that make his immigrant status different from the rest of the seemingly homogeneous Spoon Handle community. Joe faces a lot of xenophobia and pushback from the locals. Undoubtedly, though, his biggest allies are Hod and Willie. Out of all of Ruth's characters who I feel most exemplify the rejection of an insider-outsider binary, it's in fact Hod and Willie. Okay, hear me out. You have these two working class brothers who definitely represent a sort of hermit, they've been on the island forever kind of guys. No doubt you all know people like them. But let's jump back a step. Even the label of a hermit is a way to ostracize them against the normative. Though they are so grounded in the lands that they live in the most remote part of the island, everyone knows of them, and they are reliable figures for the whole community. They are still somehow othered as well. They are still somehow outsiders, even though objectively, they are extremely settled onto the local land. And though, especially in tourist season, we oftentimes resent what we consider an outsider to be, it is actually Hod and Willie's ostracization from the normative of the community that enables them to have empathy for the more traditional outsider in Joe, the Portuguese immigrant. Let's look at a quote here, which comes from Hod's perspective. In spite of the years he had known Joe and Mary, there were still times when they all at once remembered they were Portuguese and he wasn't. Not that he blamed them. After the way they were looked down on and made fun of in the village, it wasn't surprising that they were careful how they trusted anyone. He supposed he and Willie were the only people on the island who ever came easily in friendship to see the singers or sat down to eat at their table. In other words, Hod and Willie, who represent the localist of the locals, experience the stigmatization of being an outsider by being non-normative and use that experience to relate to another human who experiences the traditional label of outsider. Hod and Willie are moral heroes because of their position in both spaces. I think in a lot of ways, Ruth related to this dual identity, as I talked about earlier in my consideration of the where. Yet it is not only education that one receives when they're away. It's also perspective. Think about it. Moore herself, who wrote so eloquently about small town life in places like these, only started publishing these novels when she spent some time away. Stepping away and becoming a traditional outsider for a little bit not only exposed her to diversity and different stories, but actually created the context of Moore's belief that these small Maine towns are microcosms. Sven Davison recounts in When Fully Craddock Tore Off My Grandfather's Thumb that in the summer of 1930, Ruth worked as a special investigator for the NAACP. This was a job that required extensive traveling through the southern states. And I believe that Moore's perspective on seeing the larger American experience, along with no doubt investigating narratives of individuals who, like Joe, were victims to extreme forms of oppression and ignorance, were fundamental tools in Moore's development of a unique perspective, a perspective that could not be achieved by solely an insider and solely an outsider. A microcosm is a place with many characteristics of something much larger. In other words, even people who are largely considered insiders have many bits of outside within them. All right, so I have to admit, everyone, I have a bias towards the novel, The Walk Down Main Street. You're about to see why. So, and also I want to say that some of the people here who I've known for the past 4 years don't really know too much about this side of me. So I put these pictures so that they could appreciate them. So I'm a lifelong basketball player, technically now, sadly, retired after 4 years of Division III basketball at Bryn Mawr College. So don't tell my mom, who hates the sport, but I still play pickup every once in a while. Now, those of you who have read this really underrated Ruth Moore book might be wondering, so what does she think about this book then, if the message seems to trash basketball players and culture? And so just like my efforts to tear down the binaries of insider and outsider, I want to break down the simplicity of that question. What I'm saying is you can be a baller and love this book. So for those who haven't read this book, it's about a small town that catches the basketball winning craze. Yet when the small town their high school team loses the New England State Championship, both the town and the stars are forced to face the underlying troubles that their obsession serves to hide. To quote my article, no longer feeling superior, town members shame the teenage players for letting them down despite the high schoolers ignoring their schoolwork for months to live up to the town's expectations, shouldering the burden of success, failure, and pride of an entire community. They have an ally in first-year teacher Alfred Berg, yet he is shut down not only for his refusal to buy into the basketball-first culture, but also because of his position as an educated outsider with a Jewish identity. Mr. Berg's Jewish identity serves as the immediate indicator that he is an outsider in the town. Yet I believe his identity is also oppositional because of his refusal to buy into the craze and his view that the kids of the town are worthy of an investment into their future that is sustainable. As we come to find out from the loss at the New England State Championship game, an identity surrounding a winning basketball team is not only unethical for the pressure it puts on the kids, but completely short-sighted to a town's culture and the future of adolescents. And notably, it shows a lack of regard for perspective. And let me tell you, as someone who played for a college basketball team that didn't win more than 4 games in our most successful season, I know, winning isn't everything. So next I want to share with you all one of my favorite Ruth Moore quotes of all time. Don't curb it, he would think, watching the fierce ebb and flow up and down the floor. Point it, aim it, and let it rip. Then what a power you would have that could not be set down if you could ever be taught to use this outside a ball game. Ooh, so fun. I know this is a little tangential, but let's use my expensive English degree to do some literary analysis here. In literature, especially as you all know very often in Moore's literature, the idiom of an ebb and flow is associated pretty literally with the oceanic tide. But here, instead, it's on a basketball court. Especially in this book, which is very much about a small town, but less about coastal life, like a lot of Ruth's books are, this image is really poignant. An ebb and flow declares the thing to constantly be and change. Like the tide, it will sometimes be on the rise, sometimes on the decline, sometimes high and sometimes low. Synonymously, and for my motivations, I believe we can also see an ebb and flow as sometimes in and sometimes out. Like the tide for the majority of the time not being at its very highest or its very lowest, rather somewhere in the middle, island people likewise exist most often medially. When high tide steadily comes in, low tide leaves in its wake a warmer sun-baked ground that makes the fresh, shallow water more inviting to swim in. I know from experience. When low tide retreats, it leaves driftwood, new shells, and sand patterns. No doubt the experience of the other leaves a mark, an impact, and even the highest of tides feels the influence from the lowest of ones. Like the tide needing to withdraw in order for it to return, it requires taking a step back to gain perspective. And surely I believe it is these characters with perspective who have the most empathy and moral heroism. It is clear to me that one of Moore's biggest focuses in this novel is the idea of a town and personal identity. Thinking about Mr. Berg's larger position in American society, it also makes sense why he is one of the characters who is able to bring the most perspective. As is the case with Hod and Willie being isolated from the spoon-handled community and Harold and Sale being ostracized at school, it takes the othering and separation for the most effective empathy to grow. In other words, it is no coincidence that the characters who experience othering in their histories can also have the perspective to bring forth a mode of radical empathy. Mr. Berg undoubtedly experienced anti-Semitism throughout his life, and this othering no doubt enabled him to develop widespread empathy for anyone who is considered the other. So this is my own connection with rejecting the binary of inside and outside. So this is my 4th summer coming to the island, and many of you already know my story, so I have been practicing how to keep this as short as possible. So I sort of have bullet points here. So I had a dream about a lighthouse in my college dorm room sophomore year. I Googled lighthouses and the Bass Harbor Head came up. I emailed the local historical society that was linked to the first image that came up to see if they needed an intern. They said yes. I fell in love with the island, but particularly felt I was able to fall in love with it even more by reading Ruth Moore's books. I told my professors back home, and they helped me study New England literary regionalism even more. And now I'm a board member of THS because they can't seem to manage to get rid of me. In my previous talk, I used the seemingly common knowledge term of insider and outsider without fully interrogating it. I think we all do this in a lot of ways. Sometimes the label seems to be inevitable. Your skin color is different, your sexual orientation is against the norm. It wasn't that I necessarily was invested in the standard concept. It was just that even after reading Ruth Moore books, I didn't really take the time to think there was an alternative and explore the possibilities of deconstruction. And let me add, it is especially hard to interrogate this binary and adapt the capacity for nuance when you have really sucky, evil outsider characters like Mr. Witherspoon, who are obvious representations of harm. I therefore went into this article with that same reliable belief until I really dug into Moore's characters. It is only then when I realized Moore wasn't actually exclusively using the role of outsider and insider in a traditional and binary sense at all. The 3 main points I took away from writing this article and reading Ruth Moore's books are the roles of education, identity, and perspective in deconstructing a traditional insider versus outsider status. Education, which is most often the physical reason people have to leave their insider status, is oftentimes weaponized against the brave person that decides to leave. In Ruth's case, she was smart and outspoken, and in many cases like Sale and Harold, it is used to ostracize people from a different background. And when the former insider decides to come back, it is often the trait that makes it harder to assimilate again. Identity, whether it be town-wide or personal, is likewise contradicted by a strict way of determining outsiders and insiders. Mr. Berg's Jewish and anti-basketball craze identity seemingly made him an outsider, but his identity as one of the only advocates for the actual success of his students should in reality determine him to be the biggest insider of them all. And then there's perspective. Ultimately, it is the characters with the most perspective on their lives and positions that achieve the greatest things in Ruth's novels. Ultimately, it was Moore's perspective during her time spent away that enabled her to write such focused and vernacularly local narratives. I'm going to center myself in this discussion for a minute, so bear with me. I think I am living proof that letting an insider and outsider binary define our understanding of island people is pointless. What I've always tried to bring is respect, but what I've never wanted to hide the fact is that I'm from away. My New Jersey license plate and heavy foot on the gas pedal doesn't help either. A lot of my friends back home ask me what it's like to live in a community I seemingly suddenly inserted myself into. Some of them have those same backwards misconceptions that the Harbor kids had in Spoonhandle on what life in a more rural, compared to New Jersey, rural area of life is like. We all naturally fall into this trap when thinking about people we believe are so different from us. But this is when Moore's microcosm comes back into play. I tell my friends that one of the things I love most on the island is that the same things happen here that they do in the cities we are from, but on a more micro and more accessible level. In my talk, I went deep into family feuds, representing turf battles in cities, as Lisa alluded to, the literal idea that smaller things reflect bigger things in more urban settings. So maybe there is no inside and outside. There are just places that are smaller and larger. I carry a badge of perspective and the tools for my education, but I also know all the best, maybe not all, but soon, hopefully all the best secret swim spots and some of the local history on the island. And let me say that I feel like when a local tells you their favorite swim spot, that's the ultimate acceptance into the community. I exist as both, and there's nothing wrong with that. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if I'm an insider or an outsider. I know I love the people here, and I know there are a lot of people who love me. The blue water, green firs, and granite cliffs feel like a home in a way that I often struggle to describe. As Moore says, that was the place that you were homesick for, even when you were here. Thank you. Special shout out to the Bass Harbor Library and everyone who has been working hard there to put on the famed Ruth Moore days. There are 2 more days left in the schedule, tomorrow and on Saturday.
Anybody have any questions?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Well, that was absolutely endearingly fantastic. And
Thank you.
Thank you for trying to bridge the divides. And I'm always reminded of a certain insider who said, first thing, we blow the bridge. So, we like bridge building. I think we'll struggle with that seawall.
Yep, totally.
And I was really struck by, very late in your lecture, you, for the first time, used the word away.
Yes.
Away is a loaded word on this island. And maybe generally, I get, but, I mean, I'm thinking about somebody.
Yep.
But with your sports back,
Yep, go ahead.
can you speak to the difference between playing, home,
Yep.
and away?
So it's interesting because just like my talk, there's not either good or bad, right? So when playing home, you have the home court advantage. So, you know, your friends come and my dog would come, which was the best because when you lose by 60 points, you need some sort of reward at the end. But then, as you say, there, you know, it's also a little bit tough because losing by 60 points is a little bit embarrassing. So, you know, maybe there are some parts of being home where when you're away, it's easier to sort of forget, you know, you lose, you get on the bus, you get your meal and you head home. Versus at home, sometimes it would sting a little bit more. So yeah, that's my perspective on home versus away. Sort of maybe similar to some of the characters where, you know, you love your home and you love the pride and everyone would come dressed in yellow, but then there are still moments where it's tough to be at home, you know, especially if you have a different identity or you grow into someone that maybe is a little bit oppositional, that can be a little bit tough. So yeah, that's my perspective.
I can't wait, I do have, you mentioned I need to read the third.
Oh, of course. Which can be found at any of the libraries on the island, or the Tremont Historical Society, shout out, sells them. So stop on by Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, 1 to 4, we're open. Any more questions? Go ahead.
Did she write all of her books when she was away?
No, so I think it's actually the first two. Yep, the Spoon Handle and The Where, which is our two most famous novels that were published before she was technically fully settled in 1947 on the island. But she started a lot of her writing when she was away. Obviously, when she was in college, she wrote for her local college and published some things. And then that was when she wrote those two most famed novels. And then she wrote the rest of them when she was back on the island and settled. Mhm.
Do you think it's this home and away
Yeah.
differences is important if like you're someone who moves to the mainland town, like New Jersey?
Yep. I think that the island is a very unique place. I don't want to speak to moving to like Bangor or something. But I think being on an island that is physically divided by land and water, right? There's this literal thing that stops you. Like there are only a certain amount of roads on this island because otherwise you would just drive into the ocean. So immediately it puts into effect this idea that you are more aware of the space you are in, you are more aware of the land and the way that people take up space in that land versus a more, expansive area of land that would happen if you were on the mainland of Maine. So I think that immediately puts you into the mode of being more aware of being in a different space.
Just saying, if I played for a college baseball team, didn't win any games.
Well, our 1 in 24 season thanks you for that. Yes.
So my ancestor built the house that Ruth Moore was born in. And my mother was a native person. When she was a child, they had the only phone during World War II. They had the only phone in the area. And FDR's aide, who lived a mile away at Necker Lake, would call their house, and my mother would go out there to take a message, and then come back home. And one night it was raining, and the aide sent my mother home in a limo with his chauffeur, who happened to be African American. It was the first African American my mom had ever seen. Fast forward down to today, where all of us are struggling with the racial thing. I think the Native people here, and I've been trying to put this into words, I think you've helped me. The Native people here have as children have so many experiences because of people from away, that they are more open-minded. So when I came back to Southwest Harbor after being in college, I was stunned at how welcoming the community was to anyone and everyone. But if you were away and bought a house, they didn't need you, And my mother taught us a little bit about racial culture because of her experience, and tried to help us understand how we should never judge people. So the flip of what she's struggling with for me is then how those exposures of that dichotomy of native and away actually can be flipped over so that it makes people that are native educated in a way that other people aren't in their communities.
Definitely.
And I've been struggling for a way to explain it and say it, and you have given me the tools to know.
Well, thank you so much for that perspective. And that story you first mentioned reminds me of the chauffeur that Mr. Witherspoon has in Spoon Handle, and there's a scene that's actually sort of similar to that. So yeah, thank you for that perspective. Yes.
Can you speak to how economic class factors into Moore's formulations here in a way?
Huge. Yeah, she is the working class champion. The real, I talk about education being the reason why people have to make this binary decision of staying or leaving. And that is because of the limited economic resources that, that exist on islands. And, especially in the 20th century when there was an ebb and flow of resources, and some of her other books, I'm thinking maybe it's Speak to the Winds, but a lot of the other ones, there's the idea that the old sardine factory then becomes a cat food factory, and that all of a sudden gives a lot of jobs to people who were missing those jobs. But yeah, I think it's fundamental to her writing, especially, you know, Ruth is kind of a champion of the backside, the quiet side. And I think on an island that has a wide class disparity and has had one for a long time, to have her perspective, one that is always about working class people, was one of the things that initially drew me to her, but is something that I found is really helpful to understanding, again, not just the island, but larger issues that are existing in this country today and larger conflicts. Yes, go ahead.
Have you thought about other insider, outsider dynamics on the island?
Yes.
I think Charles Savage is a very good example.
Yeah, I mean, it's limitless, infinite, the amount of different things. Like as Lisa was saying, again, I was really interested by some of the neighbor and family feuds 2 years ago that were happening. I was staying in Seal Cove and that were happening over there. Yeah, and then as you were saying, with Indigenous people here, there are a lot of those insider-outsider conversations that are happening. And you know, we could all bring up the different things that we're seeing in our backyards. But yeah, it's definitely something I've been thinking about broader than this. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, it's a wonderful Maine office. You're gonna come back on the regular?
Oh, man. Well, you know, as the question was, will the island be affordable to live on in 10 years? I would love to come back, but I'll be living in Boston, which is pretty expensive for the next 6 years. So we'll see if what sort of job I have after this, but I would love to come back. The island is my home and the people here are some of the best people I've ever met. So I would love to be back.
Who's your favorite living Maine author?
Living Maine author. I'll have to think about that one.
Monica Wood is coming in.
You know, I just read, gosh, I can't remember the name of it. It's a murder mystery. And anyway, I'll get back to you on what the name of that is. But
Okay, cool.
that one is the one that comes to mind. He's the one who comes to mind. Yep. Any other questions? If not, thank you so much, everyone, for having me today.
Display of some of Ruth Moore's books here that are at the Northeast Trevor Library tomorrow, and we have a display of some of our history journals, Chebacco over there as well. Thank you very much.